Welcome, I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, Thus Says the Lord, God Speaks to His Servants the Prophets. Today we'll be talking about lesson 19 of our study, which covers the second half of the book of Daniel. Today we pick up from the second half of the book of Daniel. This half of this book is known primarily for being literature in a category that is called apocalyptic. Fair warning, I don't like that term very much, but it exists. Where the term comes from, the Greek word title of the book of Revelation is apocalypsis, because that is the first word in that book. These things, so many books in the Old Testament and that one in the New Testament are named according to what is the first word that shows up in the book. Genesis, Exodus, a bunch of these things, it's a history thing. The Revelation of John, in that the word revelation, apocalypsis, is the first Greek word in the book, and it's named then apocalypsis, apocalypse. Our word apocalypse comes from this. When we think of apocalypse, because of the book of Revelation, we think of the end of time and natural disasters and mass destruction and all of those things that it's not, or not just, right? That's not the core point of the book of Revelation, and it is not what the word apocalypsis means, right? We don't call usually that last book of the Bible Apocalypse because it would carry the wrong connotations, even though that's a more literal and direct English following from that Greek word. We call it the translated revelation. It's a revelation or an uncovering. That's the first point. The second one is, even when we start to see this apocalyptic literature, including Revelation and Daniel here, as an uncovering, we start to think that that means that they look forward and they tell us something about the future. Revelation does that. Daniel sort of does that. But they do it not by looking forward, but by looking back. This type of literature is rooted in a reinterpretation of the past to interpret the future, more than some kind of crazy, hallucinogenic view of the future. The very colorful and broad imagery and its wide openness to interpretation brings us to a point where it's easy to bring forth wild and speculative theories about where this might be going and what it could be telling us could happen. You can posit almost any interpretation you want to for these images, and if you can make a sort of a compelling case, there will be people who buy into and who believe what you're talking about, and there's nothing to anchor that against to make a counterpoint. No, it can't be that, it has to be something else. So there's been a lot of speculation here as well. So all in all, that is to summarize my point. I don't like the term because it either starts to connote too much, talking about only the end of the world, or maybe more insidiously leads us to want to look forward and find some kind of view or vision of the future in these things that is potentially not how they're written and how they're meant to be leading us. Whereas, counterpoint, I see in this image something that is very consistent with all of what we've been saying about prophecy, which is it is a means of uncovering or telling us some truth about God. Just like we have been saying in all of these other prophecies, they're not so much concerned with telling the future. That's not a key role of the prophet. They're instead concerned with telling us God. These things are no different. I bring this up so much now because the second half of the book of Daniel is clearly a massive inspiration for the book of Revelation. So laying the framework and understanding what's going on here is critical to seeing, because the project of the book of Revelation, as we'll get to, is similarly a deep dive into the past to understand the future, which somehow does not seem to be in the main narrative and how people look at it. But it is so obvious with this foundation in the prophets. And some of the more abstract things in the book of Revelation are clearly strong restatements or interpretations of things right here in Daniel, as we've seen some of the others from Ezekiel and from mostly all of the prophets have fed into various parts of the book of Revelation. It is a reinterpretation not just of the past but of the scriptures, especially the visions of the prophets. It is a restatement of the prophets post-Jesus to try to figure out what that prophecy still tells us in a world after the resurrection of Christ, because so much of it also told us about the resurrection of Christ. It's a massively and incredibly important project that is possible because these prophecies are all multifaceted through the course of time, right? They talk about different things that manifest in time because what they tell us is something about God who is in all times, rather than something about a specific point in our history, which is boring, especially when it's already happened. So that is a lot of setup to say we're going to dig a little bit into the nature of some of this imagery here in Daniel. Mostly we want to make sure as we're doing it that we're laying the right foundation for the next step into the book of Revelation, because that's really the culmination of this prophet study, and that's where that becomes most interesting from a prophecy point of view. So, introduction, that's our project for the lesson. And now we will get into it. Pardon my cat's use of the scratching post. He's been a little antsy, but there we go. Similarities, restatements. We start right away. Daniel, who is in, and we talked about this a little bit in the last Daniel lesson too. Daniel, who is in a foreign country under foreign powers, is having dreams and visions. Even Daniel is a restatement of a previous prophet, Joseph in Egypt, right? He has and can interpret dreams, and that's how God is speaking primarily to him. And again, John, in the book of Revelation, on the Lord's day has a vision, right? It's 1, 2, 3. It's in sequence, and it's related, and it's intentional. So this is a dream that Daniel has, that he ultimately writes down. He sees 4 beasts. There's a box in the written lesson I strongly recommend looking at. It's at the end of the lesson. It's the big gold one, Daniel's vision of 4 great beasts, that talks about the scholarly view of who these are, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks, in all likelihood, and explains a little bit of the connection. And the first point it makes, I think, is the key one. These would have been obvious to people of the time, right? We start to see, oh, these beasts with this many wings and this many eyes and this many horns and all these things, and it looks like a lion or a tiger or a bear, oh my. And it's, all of that can seem so abstract because we lack the context, right? Just like anyone who hasn't seen The Wizard of Oz wouldn't get the rather terrible joke that I just made, because it requires a certain piece of context to understand to get something, and to grasp something. So these should be treated as not as wildly abstract, crazy things, but as almost like you'd see on a flag, right? A country's flag, where you have maybe, I know the American flag doesn't have an eagle on it, but if it did, that would make sense, right? Because it's our national bird and it's a symbol of our country. And if somebody saw like a big eagle with, I don't know, bombs or something in its talons, that would be fairly synonymous with America, right? From a greater world point of view, or something representing freedom. There are a lot of things, symbolism that could be easily recognizable in our world today, to stand for a country and its dominion and its power, right? And these things are typically seen as, and I think we should treat as obvious things like that for those countries, or for those powers. So we're going to treat it like that and not dwell too much more on the particulars. Again, great box. Goes into a little bit of the detail if you want to look into it a little bit more. Where that becomes relevant, again, the book of Daniel was written after the Greek occupation of the region, and was looking back at the time in Babylon as a means of trying to wrestle with, to grapple with, to come to terms with how to coexist with the Greeks, since it had worked in Babylon. And so this is, again, reaching back into the past to try to reinterpret or to understand the present, not a looking forward from the point of view of I'm in Babylon and I can predict that Greece is eventually going to take over the whole world. It's not seeing forward, it's looking back and re-examining. Key point, it's not a vision of the future here when we see these beasts. So when it is restated and something very similar comes up and happens in the book of Revelation, why would we think that that is looking forward to things yet to come when the text that it's drawing from isn't doing it that way? So that's a point by way of setup. Interesting thing within the text itself, you have these four beasts who represent kingdoms and rule. None of them has a throne. You have someone come, this Ancient of Days come, and with that, you have thrones as well. Only one out of all of these things is acknowledged as having legitimate rule, and that is the Ancient of Days, that is God. All of these other things are seen as beasts, monsters, and God is seen as not, and as the only legitimate king. That is definitely an idea that persisted and that's like the culmination of the journey of this Jewish people, right? And a critical idea when you're trying to figure out how do we deal with the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, these other big powers. Okay, they might be powers in the world, but they are not my king. They do not have, there is a certain authority to rule that they do not have. And the way that I can coexist with them has to be on terms where I don't give to them power and authority that belongs to God. That was true then, that's true now, right? Our church has the same struggle in how we work to exist. There is an authority that belongs only to God. And if we allow man-made institutions in any capacity to assume the authority of God, it becomes monstrous, beastly, and it dehumanizes and destroys people. And so that key point, good point, as any of us figure out how to exist in this world, we have to do it in a way that keeps the authority of God first and foremost above all else, or there will be a perversion of what authority itself means and a vast dehumanization of all of us. So key point there is, again, symbolized by the fact that God is the only one of these things that looks human, right? Because the others aren't. Misused, misapplied power and authority loses that resemblance to what is human and what makes us fully ourselves, and dehumanizes us, which is a really cool point. We see big mobs of people serving and following God. Fun linguistic fact, the highest number that there's a word for in Greek is 10,000. So if you want to say a whole lot, you say 10,000, 10,000s. When the language was developing, there wasn't a need to be able to talk about more than 10,000 of something. That's obviously not true anymore, and not the case in modern Greek, but in ancient Greek, that was the thing. So when you talk about 10,000s of 10,000s, you're talking about like as much as can be counted or more. Not super important to know that, but I think it's fascinating. So bringing it up anyway. And we see the king comes and assumes authority, and while everything else persists, the others don't die yet, they don't reign anymore. That's the world in which we're meant to be right now, by the way, and even before Christ, but it was always meant to be God reigns, even if there are these other kingdoms around. Dominion, authority are not theirs, even if they feel like they are. I think of this conversation in John's Gospel between Jesus and Pontius Pilate, where Pilate, as a representative of the Roman government, feels like he has dominion, like he has power. And Jesus basically says, I scoff at your power, it's not anything. And it is almost mocking Pilate's sense of his own power. Like, you just don't know what this is. And almost seems to feel sorry for him, actually. Like, you just don't know. And you should, but you don't. But I have the power you think you have. And nothing that's coming about here is because of you. It's all because of me. But it's a conflict. It's the prime conflict between the political powers of the world and the political power of God, and the manifestation of both, and how it looks still like from the outside like Pilate has the power in that situation, and is the one controlling how things go. And it looks to Pilate and it looks to all observers as though he has that authority. But he doesn't. Nothing that's happening is happening of Pilate's will. It's all been very carefully orchestrated by Jesus, and it is what he wants. And he could stop it at any point with a word. Even without performing a miracle, there are so many things he could have said that would have changed what happened. With a word, he could have completely altered that destiny and didn't do it. Again, power is sometimes in what we don't do as well as what we do. So that's a lot of setup to say, key point about prophecy, it doesn't necessarily just look forward. It's important that it tells us something about God. These crazy images look back more than they look forward. What they're talking about here and again later is the relationship between human and divine authority, with divine authority being cast as actually more human, and human authority being cast as monstrous, which I think holds true through all of human history, and is a fascinating thing to think about that I think really fits. So those are, and then the kind of Joseph, Daniel, eventually John, the author of Revelation, few of these prophets having dreams or visions are kind of our key takeaways here, and we're only one question in, so clearly this is a big one. Moving on then, we have the Ancient of Days, the great king, and then we have here one presented before him, one like a son of man. We talked about this in the last lesson of Daniel, and went into what this phrase means a lot, which is important. And if you are watching this and you didn't see the previous lesson, you should, because we talked about that a lot, and it's a very important idea. The key point being, in this particular case, and to what we're talking about here, this is someone who is human. The Ancient of Days is described as looking like a human, but is not necessarily human, which makes sense with our theology, right? God the Father, not human, right? But then here we have this one who exercises his power, his authority on his behalf. And this one is like a son of man. This one is human. It's one of his key defining characteristics, which feels like a weird thing to have to state, except that you are talking about God. And the idea that God is human is absurd, and has to be stated. Either gods are like Greek gods, who are very humanish, and totally made up and have very limited power and are barely better than people, and definitely don't act better than people, or God is the force that drives all of the universe and has definitely nothing to do with us. The idea of an in-between, where that God is still us, is not a thing that is intuitive. And again, that's why we need revelation, right? Who would believe without us being told that that is a thing that would happen? That God would become one of us. And so that title becomes so important. Son of Man, human, but also bearing all of the dominion and authority of the Ancient of Days, also God. Again, this prophecy, not important primarily because it tells us, Jesus is going to rule the world, although obviously that is a useful and an important piece of information. Where it is far more important is you can see here this idea of the union of human and divine into one person, right? One person who is human, who wields divine authority, has the eternal nature of God, and all of the power of God. That is a crazy thing laid out here before Christ. So it does tell us of the future, right? If you understand who God is at his core, or something about him and how that works, you see still something that comes to be in the future from that, even though it's not directly telling us, in the year roughly 0, there's going to be born in Bethlehem of Judea someone who is both God and man. It's still telling us something essential about the nature of God that makes it inevitable, if we understand it, that makes Christ inevitable because of who God is. So we don't know when or how, we just know if we understand this part about who God is, that Christ is inevitable. And that, as the book of Revelation will try to do, post-Christ, what comes after is equally inevitable, what we're working toward now. Then we get another similarity to the book of Revelation. Daniel, having this vision, doesn't understand what's going on, so he grabs somebody to ask them and to get an interpretation, because he is, in the place of us as the audience, understandably confused about what's happening and needs somebody to help unpack it for him, which is very helpful for us because, of course, we don't understand what's going on in his vision either, and it's nice to get commentary on what it could mean. And that's where we see 4 great kings, and we see the people who serve God ultimately, and God's kingship ultimately taking hold and lasting forever. Here I will be brief, for me at least, because we're not, again, trying to get into a lot of the detail of these beasts. And this section is primarily a deeper dive into the 4th beast, which is, as we've talked about, the point of the book of Daniel, right? Is these terrible Greeks, 4th beast, and our ways of relating to them. This is hard. And we don't know how to deal with this. And this book is largely addressing that. So, of course, the author and the vision expands on that point because that's what we're currently trying to figure out and to deal with. And so we look at it and yeah, it's going to be bad. Key phrases will come up in Revelation. They'll rule for a time, 2 times, and half a time. Which if you add together is, of course, 3.5 times, which seems like nonsense, but that will pay off. So a time, 2 times, and half a time, when we see that, it comes from Daniel. It's not new to Revelation, which is also interesting, but we'll talk about it there. It's half of 7 is the important part that we'll get to. So I don't tease it without, at least providing part of the answer if you want to get ahead of yourself and go look. So that is the thing. Second point, if this were truly looking forward to the future, this wouldn't happen without commenting on Rome, right? Because Rome comes in and is Greece times 10. And so if this were just an attempt to catalog what's going to happen in the history of the world, it would be egregious to leave off what is coming next. But the author doesn't know, and the author's not actually writing about things that haven't happened yet. The author's writing about things that have happened in a different way. So there's no blame for not commenting on a thing that hasn't happened yet, because the author doesn't know, and the author is not trying to write the future. The author is trying to write the past and the present. Again, cannot make that point enough, because we tend to think that this is supposed to be talking about the future, and most people talk about it that way. If that were even close to true, this section would be more about Rome than Greece. And from the point of view of our world today, who knows what it might be talking about, right? Maybe it wouldn't be talking about either. Maybe there's still some super empire coming that it would be talking about. It could be the United States of America for all we know if we were doing it now. But it's never the one thing, right? There are always going to be world powers. Once human society got organized and big enough, as these small tribes became bigger and bigger and bigger groups until you had nations. By the time that we had nations, there was never not going to be a time where there's a dominant power in an area and it's generally not going to be serving the interests of God. And so, even when it claims to. And so, the challenge for us as Christians that this continually invites us to as we wind down in our second part of this journey of the prophets and conclude the Old Testament is that challenge of how do we exist in that world. where God does not have political authority. Those who serve God generally do not have political authority, and we have to exist in that world and keep our souls, which is not as easily done as said. And you see, Daniel, when he figures out what this means, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, right? This is understanding the reality of our situation is important for us to live well as Christians. It is not necessarily a calming thing to understand, and can be distressing. And that's where knowing that we are not the first people to wrestle with this issue and will not be the last can be of comfort. And that God has helped people through exactly this for thousands of years and will continue to do so. It's also worth noting when the church did have political authority, it didn't do so well with it. So maybe it's good that we're not in that position. It might not be a bad thing that we don't have political authority, because that does tend to corrupt. Anyway, the vision of Daniel. Moving on to another vision, we catch Daniel seeking supplication from the Lord for his sin and the sin of his people. Remember, in the context of the text, we are in Babylon, and the people are being punished for their sins against the Lord, but with exile in Babylon. So Daniel, being the good Jew that he is praying for relief from that punishment and that suffering. And the angel Gabriel comes to him and says, Daniel, yep, we've got you, no problem. I've heard you. That'll be taken care of, in 70 weeks of years from now. A week of years being, there are 7 days in a week, being 7 years, times 70 being a long time. It's not often that we see something looked at over this span, this scale of time. People in the ancient world, and honestly us today too, who looks that far ahead, right? It's not meaningful to me as a human now to think about what's 500 years away. But that is God's suggestion here, is you as a people are working toward a thing that is not you or your children or your children's 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 children are going to be able to receive. And all of you have to work for it. You're working for this thing that not you are going to see, or your children or your children's children's children. You have to work now for a thing that your long time descendants are going to receive. And if you don't do the work, they won't receive it. But you won't see the payoff. And that is the state of the Jewish people. They are in the mindset, right? They get back into the Holy Land and they are expecting a long distant payoff for their descendants from the work that they're doing now. And they cultivate and establish that mindset. And honestly, it's one we should learn from. As Christians, we've gotten some of the immediate gratification of, I personally come to salvation at the end of my life if I've done everything well, so that's all that matters. But it's not, right? We have a thing that we're working for the same thing that the Jewish people thought they were working for. We understand it better, we believe, but it's the same thing that we're working for. And we have the same obligation to work for it, arguably more, because we've been given Christ and we have better understanding. We have a job to do, and it's not just working out all of our individual salvation. We have a very specific job to do in what we're doing now. We are still paying for the sins of the world. Welcome to being Christian. Part of your job is to pay for all of the sins of the world while you're in it, to help bring atonement to it. That's what Jesus did. Do we think we get to not do that? And so we are meant to be serving the world and an ultimate destiny for that world that is great by our work in it now. And it is an incalculably long amount of time away, right? You can tie the period, the number 70 if you want. You can look at it a lot of ways, right? There are a few different interesting things. There's the factor of 10 in there if you want to see it, which is like 10 plagues. It's God's punishment on humanity times 7, a repeating and never-ending week, right? You do a week of 7 and then you start it over again. So it's like a never-ending period of plague, would be potentially the best view of that. If you want to get into the numerology, I don't do it too much, but it can be interesting. Not meant to be 490 years, but verging on forever. And perpetual plague or punishment from God, right? And that is kind of a fair view of the world as we know it and as we're living. But tied to that is this idea that when atonement has been made, something new happens that leaves behind the plague and the suffering and everlasting righteousness and the most holy place. Revelation will talk about how that author sees these things still in our future, and it's fascinating. But it's worth noting this was the vision then, and it's the vision, it was the vision at the time of Christ, and it's the vision now. Again, you know something about God and what he's trying to do. It's true, past, present, and future. So, still true now. So, the starting point, I'm trying not to totally anticipate everywhere we're going with the book of Revelation, and I assure you there will be much more payoff there. But again, this reads like it's directly from the middle of the book of Revelation, the hard part, as does most of this bit in Daniel here. At that time shall arise Michael the great prince. We see Michael fighting Satan in the book of Revelation. But here he is coming again in the midst of trouble to help and to deliver the people, right? And God's mightiest warrior is the one who's going to come and work to do that. The enemy changes in Revelation. We don't know who he's fighting here, but it seems like it's just these other kingdoms of the world. Whereas in Revelation, he's fighting Satan directly. So there is some difference, which is cool and interesting, and that we'll do later. But for now, big struggle. God sends his mightiest warrior to help, and we're finally going to win because God's joining the fight. And who's conquered still looks an awful lot like death, because people who were dead are not dead anymore. The enemy being defeated is more than just Alexander or some king of Greece or some king of Babylon or some king of Rome, because those beating them does not have the ability to raise the dead. Yeah, so interesting thing to think about. Who's being fought? What wins? How does God win? And what happens? The end result of the victory is not only a conquering of death, but a bringing of the world to righteousness again, right? There's this idea that the state of the world is unjust and not righteous. And God's victory will bring justice and righteousness to the world forever. Because you can't really have justice if it's temporary. It has to last in order to really be just. Then we get an interesting other point. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until that time of the end. There is tremendous drama in the book of Revelation about slowly opening, unsealing this scroll that has been sealed for who knows how long, as the end of times are coming about. Here we see, I think, the image of that scroll being sealed, right? All of this has been foretold. Here's what happens at the end. Daniel, you get to know that. Now I want you to seal it away, and we're going to leave it shut until it's ready to happen, right? It's like the words make and this is true in how Revelation looks at it, the words make the reality, right? Like it's just sitting here almost like a magic spell, right? You unseal it, you read the words, and pow, it happens. It comes to be. That's not how God works, right? He doesn't need magic words except the one living word of God that is effective by his presence and reality, who speaks all things into existence with his voice and with his will and as an expression of God. That's a magic word, but not like hocus pocus or other sorts of magic words or spells. Abracadabra being a better example, because hocus pocus is, of course, a corruption of hoc est corpus meus, this is my body, in the Latin Mass, as a means of, confecting the Eucharist. The idea of it's all such hocus pocus is actually a very anti-Catholic sentiment. So that's a bad example. Abracadabra, a much better example. So this ends up being sealed. We see again here the shift to the written word, right? We've had this vision, this idea, where its power comes is I'm going to write it down. And here is this knowledge of what's to come that I have written down that I'm going to seal up. Because the knowledge itself is dangerous, except writing it in the book of Daniel, and I'm actually going to let anybody read it. So it's not really sealed, but there's the idea of this written sealed scroll becomes an important thing as well. So anyway, end of times are coming, and again, will last forever, with righteousness and justice, and death being conquered. Then we get, again, Daniel is asking anybody he can find about what's going on, because he's clearly not getting it. There's a river, and there are people a guy on either side, at least one clothed in linen, and he asks them, when? Okay, that's everybody's main question, right? When you hear Daniel speaking for all of us, when you hear great, cool things are going to come about, when? And then we see this phrase again, a time, 2 times, and half a time. 3.5, half of 7. So even here in Daniel, we've got 2 periods of 3.5, for a total of 7 times. And again, we alluded to it earlier. If you follow along with our studies, you should be very familiar by now with this idea, but I'll repeat it because not everybody watches every part of these things, so I'll at least dwell on it a little bit. The idea of 7 gets out there, and sometimes it's talked about as the perfect number. I think that's a bad view of it, and I think anywhere else in the Bible will reaffirm that that's a bad view of it. 7 is a week, right? You've got 7 days in a week. You get to the end. With creation, you had 2 sets of 3 days that matched one another. You had, on the first day, let there be light. On the 4th day, you created the sun and the moon and the stars. On the 2nd day, you separated the waters out. It was all just water. You separated out a dome of space in the middle, so there was sky and there was ocean. On the 5th day, you created birds, fish, and sea monsters. On the 3rd day, you carved out land from that bottom part. And on the 6th day, you filled that in with vegetation and animals and people. So you had this great, perfect repeating. It was perfect and done at 6, right? You built the infrastructure, you filled it in with life. It was great. And then you had this 7th day, where God rested. Based on the pattern, that looks like you're building infrastructure that is yet to be filled in with life on an 8th day, or filled in. And then you don't have an 8th day. it hangs, right? Then you get to the end of a 7-day week and you start over. And then you get to the end and you start over. And you're never getting past 7 days. You go, I guess, from the Jewish point of view, you would go Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday again. There's not a new day after that. And it just repeats. So a 7 is a thing that repeats and is unfinished. It's like what you have, and it's a complete picture insofar as it's a full week, right? So you finish the week, it ends, but it's not really finished. It's not perfect. It, by its nature, points to a thing yet to come, and requires repetition, and an additional thing. Example, there are so many examples in the scriptures. The first one I think of right now is Jacob worked 7 years to marry Rachel, and he got a bait and switch, and he ended up marrying Leah instead. And he had to work 7 more years. He got to marry Rachel again right away, but he had to work 7 more years to pay the price for that as well. The first period of 7 wasn't sufficient to get to the goal that he wanted to get to. There was another 7 that came right after it. Again, the idea being that is not just a thing that repeats once, but that it repeats forever. And that Jacob was participating in that process. And it's everywhere. So, that is all to say, here we see this period of waiting as a period of 7. It is a repeating, perpetual, over and over, stuck period of waiting. When is this going to come to pass? Well, this whole thing is stuck. So you need some way to unstick it, to finally get out of that repeating, perpetual, endless cycle into something new. And that's where you see on such a beautiful line in the Easter liturgy of our church that talks about the coming of Christ, and says, on the ancient 1st and 8th of days. First day, you start a new week. Sunday, great. Sunday is now our Sabbath. But also the 8th day, right? Christ brings us past that stuckness into something new. He fills in what Sabbath means, right? What it means to rest in God and for God to rest in us. And most importantly, for us to be with God in that rest. We couldn't, right? When God was separated from people by whatever, the view was heaven, right? By space. But there was much more than just space that separated us. You couldn't build a rocket ship and fly up to God. The distance was incalculably greater than just space, because it was here, not there. And Christ bridges that gap, right? And allows what was lost in the garden when humanity was originally walking in the presence of God, and things were at rest and peace, and it was lost. Christ allows the bridging of that gap and the bringing together of human and divine. And so allows us to rest in God, and in the union of the two, human and divine. Which, again, right, you understand God, you understand past, present, and future. Everything from the creation of the world to now, to beyond, is pointing at that ultimate conclusion, the union of human and divine, that we are working toward and moving toward. Christ allows a version of that, right? Before Christ, there wasn't that at all. Now, there is, but it's on a limited basis, right? We are with God in heaven now. The end goal is something more akin to God is with us on earth, which is a different thing than what we have now, and a better thing. But what we have now is great. But it's not the end of what we're trying to do still. It's the 1st and 8th of days, right? It starts kind of a new cycle of week, a new cycle of work, a new state that is still working toward that ultimate conclusion. So anyway, yeah, a time, 2 times, and half a time comes back up in Revelation, and we'll see it again there. But even here, the meaning is present. This isn't how, when, we don't know. It's right now. You should treat it like it's perpetual, that this is ongoing, and who knows when it will end. Something about reality itself has to change to bring it to an end. Here we hard shift theme into a story in the middle of the book of Daniel that looks like it could also be the call of Daniel. He's not described as, oh, you know who Daniel is, and he's this great, well-respected figure in Babylon at this point. As we'll see, he's looked at kind of differently, and he's in a different spot in this story. So it's interesting that it comes later in the book. But so it is. The book of Daniel is not purely chronological in order, as we've already seen. It's kind of a mishmash of various stories about Babylon that have this probably made-up character Daniel to help tie all of it together. Maybe not made up, though, who knows. But at any rate, the narrative centers around this guy, and this is a version where he's young and shows great wisdom and insight. But for now, we don't even get to Daniel yet. We have a holy woman, Susanna, and her husband, Joachim. And then we've got a couple of people who are elders in the community who are supposed to be, who are judges, who are supposed to be, you know, the upright ones looking out for the good of the people. And we see instead that they have bad intentions. This is, as a parable, this is not just, hey, we have these 2 corrupt guys that we're not going to bother to name. Instead, it is, we have these 2 unnamed judges standing for the rulers of the people as we come into Babylon, right? Again, Daniel's in his younger days, so this is supposed to be like early, right? And this is the leftover, the remnant of what brought us here into exile, is people behaving like these guys. Disregarding, caring about justice, which we've seen is so important in the book of Daniel. It's like the main theme. The big thing we want is justice and righteousness. And here are people charged with enforcing it who are perverting and corrupting justice itself in order to get what they want, which is obviously not just or righteous. And in so doing, turn away from heaven and attempt to lead the people away from heaven as well. So that's the premise. That's where we're started. These are bad guys trying to do bad things, and they stand for the whole of the institution that led the people into exile. So we have the 2 bad guys, and they're doing a bad thing. They want Susanna. They don't care that she's married or that she is unwilling. And they try blackmail on the basis of killing her or having the crowd kill her at their word if she doesn't do what they want. Gross and disgusting behavior. Susanna, of course, being the good woman of God, says, I'm in a pickle here. There is no good course of action for me. Failing a good course of action or anything, failing a good choice, I will always choose to serve God. And so I guess go ahead and carry out your wicked plan. At least I will still be serving God. She has no delusions that she's going to get away with this, right? She thinks I'm dead. They're going to testify against me. There are 2 of them. That's enough. People are going to believe it. I'm going to die. But if I'm going to die, I'm going to die serving the Lord. But this is no fun. So that there is the situation they set up, and that is Susanna's choice. The crowd acts predictably as the 2 elders and Susanna all thought that they would. On the testimony of the elders, everybody, even though those close to Susanna say, this is surprising, we've never seen anything from her that would suggest that this could be a thing that would happen, Everybody just seems to say, oh, but they're the trusted elders of the people and judges, so they must be telling the truth. And there are two of them, so clearly, I guess we didn't really know who Susanna was after all. Might as well get to killing. And everybody seems ready to go along. She cries out, God help me. And the form that takes is, again, a young lad named Daniel. God moves him and he says, hey y'all, I'm not going to be a part of this. This is stupid. Or we haven't done a good job here, or we're not being just, or wake up, dummies, or whatever he says. I am innocent of the blood of this woman are the words that we have here. He manages, as a relatively young kid, to get the whole crowd's attention. So good on him. And this kind of is like the word of the Lord coming to Daniel, right? Maybe no evidence that it has before. And here he just says, nope, I'm not doing this. And neither should you. And then he takes it from there. Again, contrast between the people who are supposed to be exercising God's justice and judgment through the old institutions, right? Through the priesthood, through even learning and study of the law, through being judges. We see that these old institutions have been dead and corrupt. It's been the story of our entire journey through the Old Testament. From the beginning, we've talked about it, from the beginning the priesthood was flawed, the kingship wasn't much better. All of these institutions have been flawed, and it is the prophets who are here to fix that by doing something pretty close to infallible versus all of the very fallible things that have been done before, because they speak directly on behalf of and from God. So Daniel, and one does not choose to go into a life of being a prophet. They are called by particular circumstances, or by God, from whatever circumstances. So Daniel's just some young guy in the crowd, I guess ready to do some killing. And then the word of the Lord comes and nope, this is wrong. And not only am I going to say in my heart, I'm not so sure about this. This seems like we're being hasty. But I'm going to say to all of these people who are older and have more status than I do, I'm going to say, nope, this is not what we do. Huge contrast between the old way of doing things and this new way of doing things, between what a prophet is and what, for example, the priesthood is. And the difference it makes when you serve God and God speaks through you versus you're serving human ends. Being a part of an institution founded to serve God does not guarantee that you will. That's true today also. And you can do great good for God without being a part of such an institution if your heart is in the right place and you serve God and you give it everything you have and do what God is calling you to do. You don't have to be a priest or a religious or work for the church to make a massive difference in the world if you follow the promptings of God and do what he is asking you to do. Are both true. So Daniel speaks up. Finally, Daniel prompts the crowd just a little bit more by calling them fools, or are you such fools, you sons of Israel, to at least get them to go along a little bit, kind of goading his elders into, at least giving them a chance to be heard. And then he comes up with an idea somewhat reminiscent of the wisdom of Solomon. Let's separate the guys and, corroborate their stories when they're not together, and they can't tell a consistent story when they're separate, which proves the lie. we of course presume back then that people could recognize types of trees and know what they are. I don't know that that would be true for everybody today, but that seems to be assumed back then, is everybody would know and recognize and remember what kind of tree they saw. And since they say that the events happened under different trees, they're clearly lying. And so instead, the elders are convicted of bearing false witness, and Susanna is allowed to go. Showing not only the call of God to bring Daniel to speak, but the wisdom of God acting through Daniel in how he, right? The story is reminiscent of Solomon's wisdom, deliberately as a way of showing God's wisdom acting through the prophets. So not only is it courage, or, there are lots of gifts of the Holy Spirit, right? But we see in this case, wisdom coming to bear as well in showing Daniel the right way to deal with or to uncover what is going on here. So the gifts of the Holy Spirit trump any kind of human institutions, which should be obvious and go without saying, but it's useful to say from time to time because we can put too much reliance on institutions outside of the Spirit. And Jesus built our church in a way that intends to inextricably link the two together, right? So that the church is necessarily guided by that Holy Spirit to keep from just being a failed, flawed human institution like the ones before it. I'm going down the same road. It doesn't mean we don't also do that, unfortunately. But there are protections in place at the highest level and at the founding of our church that protects it from itself and from us, ultimately. No matter the fact that there will always be corrupt people in religious institutions doing corrupt things. At the core and foundation of our church is still the call of the Holy Spirit, which to a great deal protects it, or at least what's core and essential to it from that. So Jesus ultimately fixed the problem. Back then, Daniel at least fixed it in one specific area. And again, it's a call to reflect on the difference between a prophet and some of these other things that came before. They get talked about a lot less, right? We move away from talking about priests and talking about kings, and we talk primarily about prophets and their role, and that is the bridge that gets us to Jesus. He doesn't emerge from, although he does emerge from that line of priest and that line of king, he emerges most directly and immediately from that line of prophet. And it's when the prophets reign that Jesus comes. Because they are able to do correctly what the others failed at. And so, of course, Jesus would stand primarily in that role of a prophet, and in so doing fix what was intended by the priesthood and the kings as well. And we'll see that. That's where we're going. We're through the Old Testament part of this study. We are going to look at Jesus as prophet and to a lesser extent priest and king, and John the Baptist as the bridge point here as well. We are going to transition from this great, powerful, potent thing that has been built by the prophets that is good and powerful. And we're going to see that realize its potential through the acting of John the Baptist, channeling into, leading it all into Christ, who brings it. John is kind of the point that connects the old and the new, we'll see. And then Jesus gets to just be the new. And reshape and remake all of these things. And then ultimately we'll look at, again, with the new beginning comes an expectation of a new end. And that's where we look also at the book of Revelation. So we've still got 4 lessons to get through, wrapping this up as the New Testament restates some of this, and we continue to see a fulfillment of this prophecy, and an additional look forward toward what some of it suggests for our future as well. But we kind of are tying a bow here on this is the Old Testament part of this. So if you've been following along with us through the Kings, United and Divided, and a couple of books of prophets, this is a massive culmination. Congratulations, you made it through the Old Testament. You will have a vastly better understanding of the journey of the people of Israel, their history, their failures and flaws, and the steps God took to correct that, and ultimately what has gotten it enough right that these people are ready for Christ. Right? It's not that God didn't want to send Christ in Genesis and skip all of this. It's that the people were not ready to receive what God wanted to give. And so this journey of the Old Testament has been a journey of getting the people ready to receive Christ. As our journey with Christ is again a preparation, getting us ready to receive the full presence of God into our world, which we're not ready yet, right? Right? You cannot see the face of God and live. Still holds true in our world today. It would be devastating to our world if God showed up now. He doesn't fit yet, or rather we don't fit with him. There's too much of an incompatibility between us and God right now for God to come here without just wiping us out. But we're trying to get now to that point where we can once again live with God. Not there yet, but that we'll see is what Jesus is trying to get us to now. So once again, still an endpoint, not a finished journey, but this step of the path that we've been going through in the Old Testament, we've hopefully wrapped up, and now we can start talking about the next one. So thank you all for journeying along with us through this. It's been quite a ride. Hopefully we're all wiser for having gone through it and know some better things about how we can live our lives. And it will be great with this foundation to dig into and to look at Christ, which we'll do in the next lesson. This has been an overview of Lesson 19 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.